A billionaire CEO disguised himself as a janitor to help a little girl scrubbing floors, then uncovered a secret that changed all their lives forever. Jason Reeves had never arrived at the office so early. Normally, his driver would pull up to the private entrance just before 8, where polished shoes stepped out onto pavement and glass doors opened automatically before him. But today, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he woke before sunrise with an unusual restlessness in his chest. He dressed without help, skipped breakfast, and drove himself. The city was still asleep. Streetlights flickered against the soft orange tint of morning, and fog clung low to the sidewalks. He pulled into the parking lot of Sterling Industries, a glass and steel monument to wealth and precision, and parked in a space usually reserved for delivery vans. The building loomed silent, not yet buzzing with assistants, phones, and meetings. He liked it this way, clean, untouched, and still. Only the security guard, Frank, was there, sipping weak coffee from a paper cup at the front desk, eyes barely open. As Jason stepped into the marble lobby, something unexpected caught his attention. There, near the far wall beneath the wide stairway, a small figure moved low to the ground. He slowed his steps, his polished shoes clicking faintly against the floor, and saw her clearly for the first time. A little girl, crouched down on her knees, was wiping the floor with a damp blue rag. She wore a faded blue janitor jumpsuit and a slightly too large white t-shirt. Her light brown hair was tied back in a crooked braid, strands falling over her face as she scrubbed carefully, silently. She looked no older than 6. Her arms were thin, her hands red from water and rough tile. But it was the expression on her face that stunned him, focused, sad, and far too serious for a child. There was no whining, no playing. She worked with the kind of quiet precision that only comes from necessity. Jason paused in his steps and turned to the guard. "Frank, who is that?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Frank stood up slowly, looked in the direction Jason was pointing, and sighed. "That's Hannah. Her mom's the night cleaner here. She's in the hospital. ICU. Slipped into a coma last week." Jason's eyebrows furrowed. "And the girl, what's she doing here?" "She showed up 2 days ago," Frank said, voice heavy. "Said she was going to do her mom's job until she got better. We tried to tell her no, tried to give her some money, some food. She won't take it unless she earns it. Says her mom taught her that. Says, we don't take handouts." Jason stared at the girl. The way she moved. The look in her eyes. It didn't seem real, this child in a world of adults, surrounded by marble and steel, cleaning floors before sunrise as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She's 6, Jason said quietly, almost to himself. "Yeah," Frank nodded. "But she acts like she's 60. Jason stood there for another minute, watching as Hannah dipped her rag into a small bucket and wrung it out with both hands, her little fingers barely strong enough to twist the cloth. She moved to the next tile with slow, practiced effort. She didn't look up, didn't speak, just kept working. Something deep in Jason stirred. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was something stronger. Something he hadn't felt in years. A sense that this wasn't just wrong, it was unacceptable. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the service hallway. Frank called after him, confused. "Mr. Reeves? Everything all right?" Jason didn't stop. "Where do we keep the janitor uniforms?" he asked. Frank blinked. "In the supply closet, down the hall, room 3C. Why?" But Jason didn't answer. He was already gone, his footsteps silent, swallowed by the stillness of the empty corridor. The supply closet smelled like disinfectant, old mop heads, and time. Jason stood inside, surrounded by shelves lined with bottles of industrial cleaner, brooms leaning in corners, and stacks of folded gray jumpsuits, all slightly too big and worn from constant use. He found one in his size and ran his fingers over the rough fabric. It was nothing like the $1,000 suits tailored to his frame, but in that moment, it felt more significant than anything in his wardrobe. He slipped out of his dress shirt, tie, and jacket, folded them neatly, and pulled on the gray jumpsuit. It scratched against his skin, unfamiliar and stiff, but he zipped it up without hesitation. He found a pair of worn sneakers in the corner, clearly for staff, and exchanged his leather dress shoes for them. His reflection in the mirror startled him. The man who looked back wasn't the CEO of a billion-dollar company. He looked like a janitor, invisible and unnoticed. He stepped out of the closet and returned to the lobby quietly, careful not to draw attention. Hannah hadn't moved far. She had finished the tiles near the elevator and was now working near the windows. She was on her knees, her back hunched as she scrubbed at a scuff mark that was likely there for years. Her little body looked even smaller in the vast space. Jason crouched beside her without speaking. She noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye, flinched slightly, then looked at him. Her eyes widened for a moment, but not from fear, just surprise. She studied his face, perhaps wondering if she'd seen him before. But in the janitor's uniform, he was just another worker. "Hi," he said softly, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't feel like an intrusion. "Mind if I help?" She blinked, unsure. "You're new," she said. "First day," he replied with a small smile. She studied him again. "You don't look like a janitor." Jason chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, I get that a lot." She didn't respond immediately. She just nodded once and moved over a little to give him space. He dipped a clean rag into her bucket, wrung it out slowly the way she did, and began wiping the floor beside her. It had been years, decades, really, since he had done any sort of physical labor. His knees hurt within minutes and his back ached from bending, but he didn't stop. Not because he wanted to impress her, but because he couldn't imagine walking away. They worked side by side for several minutes in silence. The only sounds were the wet dragging of rags on tile, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, and the occasional creak of the building settling. Finally, Hannah spoke. "My mom usually does this part," she said, still scrubbing. "She says windows are the most important, because it's what people see first." Jason glanced at the long pane of glass she was wiping. "She sounds smart." "She is," Hannah said quickly, with pride. "She taught me everything. She says when you clean something, you should be proud of it." Jason looked at her, then at the floor he'd just cleaned. "You do a really good job." She didn't smile. Instead, she looked down and said quietly, "It's the only thing I can do now." The weight of her words settled over him like a stone. A child who had been forced to take on the role of provider. A child who believed that cleaning a floor was all she had to offer the world. He wanted to say something, to tell her she deserved more, that it wasn't her responsibility. But she wasn't asking for comfort. She was doing what needed to be done. After a while, she sat back on her heels and wiped sweat from her forehead with the sleeve of her jumpsuit. Jason did the same, his hands aching. He looked over at her and asked, "Do you ever get help from anyone?" She shook her head. "Mom says not to expect it. People are busy. They don't notice you unless you're in the way." Jason swallowed hard. He knew she was right. He had walked past hundreds of people in this building, day after day, without truly seeing any of them. "Do you like school?" he asked, trying to steer the conversation somewhere lighter. She shrugged. "I used to. But I haven't gone in a while. Since Mom got sick. They said someone from social services would come, but I didn't want to leave her." Jason's mind raced, imagining the kind of life she'd been living, alone, with no one but a coma-stricken mother, surviving on stubbornness and memories. She didn't belong here on this cold floor. She belonged in a classroom, in a park, in a world where someone else carried the weight. Eventually, the morning light grew brighter, creeping across the lobby floor. The building would soon wake up with voices, footsteps, and executives carrying lattes. Jason knew he couldn't stay here forever, not like this, but he also knew something inside him had shifted. This girl, without knowing it, had turned his world upside down. He stood slowly, joints stiff, and looked down at her. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. She gave him a small nod. "Okay." As he walked back toward the closet to change, he realized it was the first time in years that he had looked forward to tomorrow. The next morning, Jason arrived even earlier than before. The sky was still dark, with only a faint glow on the horizon, and the streets were nearly empty. He parked in the same spot as the day before, bypassing the executive garage entirely. This time, he didn't wear a suit. Instead, he came dressed in simple clothes, the janitor's jumpsuit folded neatly in the passenger seat. As he walked toward the building with it slung over his shoulder, he felt an unusual lightness in his chest, something close to anticipation, though he wouldn't have called it that out loud. The lobby was as silent as it had been the day before, but something felt different now. It wasn't just the stillness, it was the presence of something waiting to happen. He nodded to Frank, who raised an eyebrow in recognition but didn't say a word. The two men had reached a silent understanding. Jason went straight to the supply closet, changed quickly, and stepped back into the open space just as Hannah appeared from the side hallway, dragging her little bucket and rag along the tile. She looked at him and blinked once, almost as if checking that he was real. He gave her a small wave, and she gave a smaller one in return. Then she crouched down and resumed cleaning as if nothing had changed. Jason did the same. They didn't speak at first. The rhythm of the work filled the space between them, dipping the rag, scrubbing the tiles, shifting the bucket forward. But there was a comfort in the silence now, a kind of quiet companionship that didn't need to be named. At some point, Hannah broke it gently, not looking up from her work. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated for a split second, then said, "Jay." It wasn't a lie, not really. No one had called him that in years, but it was still a part of him. She nodded. "I'm Hannah. I guess you already knew that." He smiled faintly. "Yeah. Frank told me a little." She wrung out her rags slowly, then said, "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, but I think you're okay." Jason's smile widened just a little. "Thanks. I'll try not to mess that up." They kept working. This time, Jason had brought gloves. His knees were still sore from the day before, and the skin on his hands had felt raw that night in the shower. But somehow, none of that mattered here. What mattered was that this little girl, who had every reason not to trust anyone, had chosen to let him sit beside her again. At one point, Hannah paused and asked, "Do you think people notice clean floors?" Jason looked around. The lobby floor gleamed in the early light, spotless and shining. "They don't," he admitted. "They just notice when it's dirty." She nodded as if that confirmed something she already believed. "That's what Mom says too. That it's okay to do good things even when nobody sees them." Jason stared at her for a moment, trying to process how a 6-year-old could be so clear about something most adults never understand. He wanted to tell her that what she was doing mattered. That he saw it. That she mattered. But all he said was, "Your mom sounds really smart." "She is," Hannah replied without hesitation. "She used to say, 'Clean one thing a day and never lie.' That's the rule." Jason found himself thinking about that rule long after she said it. Clean one thing a day and never lie. It was simple. Powerful. And somehow, it made the rest of his life, his sprawling business empire, his board meetings, his acquisitions, feel strangely hollow. As they continued working, the first signs of the workday began to appear. The elevator dinged in the distance. The coffee machines powered on in the break rooms. Jason stood up slowly, brushing off his knees, and glanced at the large wall clock. It was nearly 7. Soon the employees would begin arriving. He knew he couldn't be seen like this again, not yet. Not without questions he wasn't ready to answer. He turned to Hannah and said, "I've got to go upstairs soon. Do you want me to bring breakfast tomorrow? Something warm?" She tilted her head slightly, unsure. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said. She shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, hope, maybe, or curiosity. "Okay. But nothing fancy. I like plain toast." Jason nodded. "Plain toast it is." She watched him leave, and for a moment, he felt her gaze following him down the hallway like a thread tying them together. Back in the supply room, he changed quickly, smoothed his hair, and buttoned his shirt as if nothing had happened. When he entered his executive office minutes later, no one could have guessed he'd just spent an hour scrubbing floors with a child. But inside, he knew he was different. Something about Hannah, about the way she carried herself, about the quiet strength behind her sad little eyes, had begun to shift something inside him. She didn't need saving. She needed someone who showed up. And for the first time in his life, Jason Reeves wanted to be that person. Not just for a morning. Not just in secret. But for real. Jason didn't tell anyone about the girl. Not his executive assistant, not the board members, not even Frank the security guard beyond what was already said. It felt too delicate, too personal, too unlike anything he'd ever done. Each morning, before the building came to life, he'd arrive in darkness, change into the gray jumpsuit, and meet Hannah in the lobby. It became a rhythm neither of them questioned. By the 4th morning, she no longer looked surprised to see him, she simply handed him a clean rag and pointed to the section of the floor she hadn't reached yet. No small talk, no big welcomes. Just the kind of quiet acceptance that only forms through mutual presence. Jason learned her patterns quickly. She always started with the baseboards, then moved on to the tiles, finishing with the glass. She worked with intensity, like a clock wound too tightly, always focused, always trying to make things perfect. He admired her dedication, but at the same time, he felt the weight of it. This wasn't just a task for her, it was a mission. It was survival. One morning, as they sat side by side scrubbing beneath the large window panels, he finally asked, "What do you do after this?" Hannah didn't answer immediately. She continued wiping the glass, pushing the cloth in wide, circular motions. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. "I go to the hospital. They let me see her for a few minutes a day. Sometimes she's awake, but she doesn't talk. She just looks at me and blinks." Jason nodded slowly. "Does anyone go with you?" "No. The nurses know me now. They give me 10 minutes if they're not busy." He hesitated, the rag in his hand going still. "You go alone every day?" She looked up at him for a moment and then shrugged, as if that detail didn't matter. "She's my mom." That answer did something to him. Not in a dramatic way, but deeply. It was the type of response that held both pain and pride, the kind that made Jason question everything he thought he understood about responsibility and love. He had built empires, mentored executives, handled billions in assets, but this child, who had nothing, who asked for nothing, embodied more strength than most of the people he'd ever worked with. He didn't want to pry too much, but the words escaped him anyway. "What about your dad?" Hannah didn't flinch. "Never met him. Mom said he wasn't someone worth missing." Jason absorbed the words without replying. For several minutes they worked in silence again, but something had shifted in the air between them. She had opened a small window into her life, and he felt an even greater responsibility now, not just to keep showing up but to do something that mattered. As the sun began to creep through the glass, lighting the freshly cleaned floor, Hannah stood and stretched her arms with a small groan. Jason offered her the water bottle he'd brought. She took it, nodded her thanks, and sipped slowly. "Why do you help me?" she asked suddenly. Jason looked at her, caught off guard. "Because no one should have to do this alone." She narrowed her eyes slightly, like she was trying to read between the lines. "But I'm not your problem." "No," he said, placing his rag back in the bucket. "You're not a problem at all." She seemed to consider that. Her face softened just a little, and for the first time, she smiled, not wide, not showy, but real. A tiny, fleeting curve of her lips that vanished almost as quickly as it came. Still, Jason saw it. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, that small smile felt more rewarding than any award or bonus he'd ever received. Later that afternoon, back in his office wearing a tailored suit and sitting behind a desk made of imported wood, Jason couldn't concentrate. The emails were piling up. There were decisions to be made, reports to approve, calls to return. But his mind kept circling back to Hannah, her hands reddened from bleach water, the way she folded her rag just so, the quiet courage in her voice. He opened a new tab on his computer and began searching. Hospitals. Patient records. Legal guardianship. School re-enrollment for children without active parents. At some point, his assistant knocked and reminded him of a finance meeting. He waved it off, eyes still fixed on the screen. That evening, he called a contact from a legal firm that handled delicate family cases. When they picked up, he spoke without hesitation. "I need help with a child," he said. "And I don't want anyone to know, not yet." The voice on the other end was confused at first but professional. "Is this for a relative?" "No," Jason said. "It's for someone who doesn't have anyone else." When he hung up, he leaned back in his chair, the city lights flickering in the window behind him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man at the top of the world. He felt like a man trying to find his way to something real. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: he was all in. The morning after his call with the lawyer, Jason arrived at the building even earlier than usual. The city was still cloaked in darkness, streetlights glowing in silence, and the first hints of dawn only just starting to touch the skyline. The moment he stepped inside the lobby, he felt the now familiar presence of Hannah somewhere nearby. It was strange how quickly her presence had become an anchor to his day, how much her being there grounded him, focused him. He changed into the janitor's uniform without hesitation, hanging his coat and tie neatly in the closet, and emerged just as Hannah was arriving from the side hallway with her bucket in one hand and the blue rag in the other. She gave him a nod, now their routine form of greeting, and set the bucket down with practiced precision. Jason knelt beside her, and together they began cleaning in silence. It had become their rhythm, no small talk in the beginning, just the work, the movement, the quiet understanding that for now, this was the world they shared. But Jason's mind was anything but quiet. As they scrubbed side by side, he couldn't stop thinking about the meeting he had scheduled for that afternoon. His lawyer had found records of Rachel Brooks, Hannah's mother. She had no family listed, no living relatives willing to take custody. The hospital considered her case low priority, with only a nurse occasionally checking in during her unconscious hours. The state was beginning to process emergency foster placement for Hannah. Once the system moved, she would be gone, placed into a group home, removed from the building, from the only routine she had managed to create since her mother's collapse. And from Jason. He didn't have a plan yet. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing. He'd never considered becoming a guardian, had never wanted children, had never even let a pet live in his penthouse. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. What mattered was that this little girl, who refused to ask for help and kept showing up with the determination of someone far older than her years, had become someone he couldn't turn away from. "Hannah," he said softly, dipping the rag in the bucket again. "What would you do if you didn't have to work here every morning?" She paused, looking up at him. I don't know. Probably sit in the hospital lobby until they let me in. What about school? I used to like it, she said. But I didn't like the questions. They'd ask about my mom, or why I wore the same shoes every day. It made me feel like a problem. Jason swallowed the lump in his throat. You're not a problem. She looked down, her fingers twisting the cloth tightly. I know. But people don't always agree. They fell into silence again. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Jason knew he couldn't promise her the world, but he could change her world, even if it meant stepping far outside of his own comfort zone. Later that afternoon, he met with the lawyer in a private office above the main building. He laid everything on the table: Hannah's situation, the legal status of her mother, the lack of family, and his desire to intervene before she disappeared into the system. The lawyer listened carefully, brows furrowed. You understand what you're asking for, she said. Temporary guardianship is one thing, but long-term? You'll need to be approved by the courts. Child services will run background checks, home visits, psychological assessments. It's not a simple process. I don't care how complicated it is, Jason replied. Just tell me where to start. You'll also need her mother's consent, if she regains consciousness. Or the court will have to declare her unfit to parent. Jason nodded. I'll wait as long as it takes. But I'm not letting her get lost in the system. The lawyer made a note and leaned back. You're not doing this for charity, are you? Jason's eyes met hers. I'm doing this because she showed up every morning without anyone. And because she deserves someone to show up for her. Over the next week, things began to shift. Jason continued to meet Hannah each morning, still wearing the jumpsuit, still helping her clean. But he also began asking her more questions, not to pry, but to understand what she needed, what she feared, what gave her comfort. He learned she liked drawing but never had her own pencils. He learned she liked rainy days because fewer people were around. He learned that she hummed under her breath when she was nervous. He also began preparing his home. He hadn't brought a child into it before. The silence, the glass walls, the sharp corners, none of it felt right for someone like Hannah. So he ordered rugs, soft lights, a bed small enough for her frame, and a blanket in the exact shade of blue she always wore. He set up a small table with art supplies and bought a bookshelf he didn't know how to fill yet. Hannah didn't know about any of this. To her, Jason was just Jay, the janitor who worked beside her. She didn't ask for more. She didn't even ask what he did after they cleaned. But one morning, after they'd finished wiping down the entryway, she turned to him and asked, "Why do you come here?" Jason paused. Because it's the only part of the day that makes sense. She tilted her head. You mean cleaning floors? He looked at her with a quiet smile. I mean being with you. She didn't say anything in response, but something softened in her face. A kind of peace settled in her small shoulders, as though she'd been waiting for someone to say that and believe it. That night, Jason sat alone in his apartment, reading through the guardianship documents. They were filled with legal terms, references to state codes, and lines requiring signatures he wasn't used to writing outside of business. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was closing a deal. He felt like he was opening a life. And this time, it wasn't just about changing hers. It was about changing his own. The call came earlier than he expected, far earlier. Jason was sitting at his desk late one evening, long after his staff had gone home. The office was dim, lit only by the glow of his computer screen and the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass. He had been reviewing one of the child welfare reports his lawyer had sent him when his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. Something in his gut told him to answer. Mr. Reeves, a soft, professional voice asked. This is Nurse Ellie from St. Francis Hospital. You're listed as the emergency contact for Rachel Brooks. Jason sat up straighter, heart tightening. Yes, I am. What's happened? She's awake, the nurse said gently. Not fully alert, but responsive. She's opened her eyes, and she nodded when we asked her name. She can't speak yet, but she's conscious. For a long moment, Jason said nothing. Relief hit him unexpectedly hard, mixed with a strange current of anxiety. He thanked the nurse, got the address, and hung up without even realizing he was already standing and reaching for his coat. The drive to the hospital was silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced with questions. Would Rachel remember anything? Would she be able to speak to Hannah? Would she want to? And what would she think of him, a stranger, stepping into her daughter's life uninvited? He walked through the sterile corridors of the ICU with slow, measured steps. The fluorescent lights cast a clinical glow over the polished floor, and the air carried the distant beeping of monitors and whispered conversations between nurses. He stopped at room 112 and took a breath before gently pushing the door open. Rachel Brooks looked fragile beneath the white sheets. Her face was pale, framed by tousled dark hair, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. There was a tube in her arm, monitors surrounding her bed, and her chest rose and fell with the help of shallow breaths. But she was awake. Her eyes turned to him slowly when he entered. He stood still at the door for a moment, not wanting to startle her. Then he stepped closer and said quietly, "Hi. My name is Jason. I've been helping Hannah." Her eyes blinked once, slowly, and filled with something that resembled confusion but also relief. He could see tears starting to form. She tried to speak but couldn't. Instead, she reached for a nearby notebook and weakly scribbled something on a page. Her handwriting was shaky and small, but he leaned over to read it. "Is she okay?" Jason smiled, eyes stinging. "She's more than okay. She's strong. And brave. She's been coming here to see you every day. I don't think she's missed a single one." Rachel closed her eyes for a long moment, as if absorbing the weight of those words. When she opened them again, she motioned for the pen once more. "Who are you?" she wrote. Jason hesitated. It was a fair question. What could he say that wouldn't sound like a lie or an exaggeration? "I'm someone who saw her," he said softly. "Really saw her. She was cleaning the lobby of my office building. Said she was working for you. Refused to take a handout. So I stayed. I've been helping her. I didn't plan any of it. I just couldn't walk away." Rachel's hand trembled as she wrote again. "Thank you." He shook his head. "She saved me, too. You should know that." They sat in silence after that, the weight of their shared connection building quietly between them. He didn't tell her everything yet, not about the guardianship papers, not about the meetings with lawyers, not about the room he'd prepared for Hannah. It wasn't time. Rachel had just come back to life, and Jason knew that her place in Hannah's world, if she could keep it, came before anything he could offer. When he finally stood to leave, Rachel gestured toward the nightstand where a framed photo of Hannah sat, a small school picture, slightly bent at the corner. "She's been carrying that with her," the nurse said from the doorway, watching quietly. "She sets it next to her bed every night she visits. Wouldn't go home until she knew her mom had it close." Jason left the hospital with a strange ache in his chest, part pain, part joy. Hannah's world had been so fragile, suspended between hope and loss. Now, for the first time, it felt like something solid was forming beneath her feet again. The next morning, when he met her in the lobby, she was already working, as usual, bucket in hand, wiping a section of floor near the base of the stairs. She looked up as he approached and offered a quiet "morning," as she always did. He crouched beside her and took the rag she passed him. They worked side by side for a few moments in their shared routine before he spoke. "I went to see your mom last night," he said gently. Her hand froze mid-motion. She didn't look at him right away. Her eyes stayed on the floor. "She's awake," he continued. "Not all the way, but she opened her eyes. She knew your name." Hannah dropped the rag and stared at him now, lips parted, expression unreadable. "You're not lying," she whispered. "I wouldn't lie about that." She stood up quickly, almost stumbled, and backed up as if she needed space to feel the weight of the news. Her hands covered her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry, not like a child. She just nodded over and over, like she was holding herself together piece by piece. "I thought." She began, but couldn't finish. Jason stood as well. "You can go see her today. I'll drive you myself, if you want." She nodded again, this time slower, and walked toward the staff closet without saying another word. She moved like someone waking from a long nightmare, unsure if the world she stepped into was real. That afternoon, Jason stood outside Rachel's room and watched through the glass window as Hannah entered. Her small figure paused in the doorway. Rachel looked up from her bed, her eyes widening as Hannah ran to her, wrapping her arms around her with a tenderness and force that seemed to fill the whole room. Jason turned away then, giving them privacy. He didn't need to witness what came next. He had done what he came to do. He had kept his promise. But in the quiet of the hallway, as he leaned against the cold wall, he realized something deeper: this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And no matter what happened next, he wasn't going anywhere. The days that followed moved slowly, as if time itself was reluctant to disturb the fragile beauty of what had just begun. Rachel's condition stabilized, and though she was still weak, she had regained enough strength to sit up, to whisper short sentences, and to hold Hannah's hand without trembling. The nurses said her recovery, while uncertain, had taken a hopeful turn. Hannah stayed by her side every moment the hospital allowed, clinging to every breath, every blink, every word from her mother as if it were a miracle in motion. Jason, though often in the background, remained ever present, driving Hannah to and from the hospital, bringing her meals, sitting silently in the waiting room so she'd never feel alone when visiting hours ended. Rachel had begun to ask him more questions, always quietly, always with careful eyes. "Who are you really? Why would a man like you do all this for someone you didn't know?" Jason never had a single answer. Instead, he told her pieces of the truth, moments stitched together like stepping stones. He spoke of the early mornings, of the small girl kneeling on a cold tile floor with more strength in her little hands than most men he knew. He spoke of how he felt drawn to her, not out of pity, but because of something deeper, something unexplainable. He told Rachel how helping Hannah had reminded him of things he'd forgotten: how to show up for someone, how to feel useful beyond profit, how to care without expecting anything in return. Rachel listened without judgment. Her eyes would fill, but she wouldn't cry. She just nodded, as if somewhere deep inside, she already knew all of it. Eventually, when she was strong enough, Rachel asked about Hannah's life during the weeks she'd been unconscious. Jason told her everything: how her daughter had insisted on cleaning the lobby floors each morning, how she'd refused money she hadn't earned, how she had kept showing up, determined to take care of her mother's job. He didn't hold back the parts that hurt, the parts that made it clear how much Hannah had sacrificed. Rachel listened in silence, her hands shaking slightly, and when he finished, she whispered, "I raised her not to need anyone, but I never wanted her to be alone." Jason reached over and gently placed his hand over hers. "She's not alone now." Meanwhile, at the office, things had begun to shift in ways Jason hadn't expected. Employees whispered stories of their CEO arriving before sunrise, rumors of him cleaning floors with a child, of changes in his tone, his behavior, his gaze. People noticed he stayed in meetings longer, listened more closely, took more time with decisions that used to be automatic. Some attributed it to a midlife change. Others speculated about charity work. No one really knew the truth, but the atmosphere in the building began to change, subtly at first, then more noticeably. Departments that had once operated in cold silos began to collaborate more willingly. Staff meetings included moments of silence and recognition for the janitorial team. Someone anonymously started leaving thank you notes for night workers. It was as if one child had unknowingly reminded an entire corporation that people mattered more than performance. One morning, as Hannah stood in the lobby watching the sun rise through the tall windows, Jason handed her a small box. She opened it slowly, cautious as always, and inside she found a simple name tag, white, with black letters, Hannah Brooks, honorary staff member. Her eyes widened slightly. She looked up at Jason, confusion on her face. "But I don't work here anymore." He smiled. "No, you don't have to. This is just so everyone knows you helped build something here." Hannah stared at the tag, turning it over in her fingers. After a long pause, she whispered, "Can I still come sometimes?" "Anytime," Jason said. "As often as you want." Not long after, Rachel was released from the hospital. The recovery would be long, months, maybe years, but she was ready to return home. The only problem was, they no longer had one. Their old apartment had been cleared after Rachel fell into the coma. With no rent payments, no income, and no one to speak for them, the building manager had legally removed their belongings. The system had failed them quietly, without mercy. When Jason heard the news, he didn't hesitate. He had already prepared a space in his home, not because he expected them to move in, but because something inside him had insisted it was time to make room. The guest suite was transformed into a two-bedroom haven, one room for Rachel, the other for Hannah. He had filled them with warm tones, soft rugs, bookshelves, and toys he wasn't sure were age-appropriate, but he hoped they would be loved. When he offered it to them, Rachel resisted at first, her pride still intact despite her condition. But Hannah had taken her mother's hand and said, "Please. I want us to be safe." They moved in 2 days later. Life settled into a new rhythm. Jason no longer wore the janitor's jumpsuit each morning, but he kept it in his closet, carefully folded. Sometimes, when no one was home, he would take it out and run his hands over the worn fabric, remembering the days that changed everything. Rachel spent her days regaining her strength, slowly, cautiously, while Hannah enrolled in school again. She began drawing, laughing more, and even making friends. Jason noticed how her voice had grown louder, her steps quicker, her eyes brighter. She had begun to live. One evening, as the three of them sat at the dinner table, eating takeout and listening to music on low volume, Hannah looked up from her plate and asked, "Can I call you something?" Jason raised an eyebrow. "Sure. What is it?" She hesitated. Then, very quietly, she said, "Can I call you family?" Rachel didn't speak. She just looked down at her hands, and Jason felt something shift inside him again, something slow and permanent. He nodded. "Yes. Of course." No ceremony marked that moment. No papers were signed. But in that quiet room, beneath the warm glow of soft lighting and simple food, a new kind of bond was sealed, not by law or blood, but by presence, by choice, and by love that had grown slowly, silently, and unshakably strong. The months that followed unfolded gently, with the kind of slowness that allowed healing to take root. The house was no longer a silent monument of glass and steel, it was filled with the sound of life, light footsteps running down hallways, soft music playing from an old radio in the kitchen, the quiet murmur of bedtime stories read aloud. Rachel continued to grow stronger. Her voice returned in full, and her body, though still tired, moved with purpose again. She insisted on doing things for herself, despite Jason's offers to help. She began cooking simple meals, reading again, and helping Hannah with her homework in the evenings. Her resilience inspired him more than any business success ever had. Jason adjusted to his new life with a kind of grace that surprised even him. Board meetings no longer defined his week. He was still the CEO, still respected, still in command, but something fundamental had changed. He no longer stayed late at the office, no longer chased projects for the thrill of conquest. He came home on time. He asked Hannah about her school day before reading the financial news. He found himself wanting less from the world and more for moments like watching Hannah curl up with a book, or hearing Rachel hum a song while folding laundry. What no one outside their home knew was that Jason had made a decision long ago. Not just to help. Not just to provide. But to belong. With the help of his legal team, he filed for legal guardianship of Hannah, not to take her away from Rachel, but to give her another layer of safety, another adult she could count on without fear. Rachel hesitated at first. She was protective, understandably cautious, but in the end, she understood what Jason already knew: love, when real, could be shared. It didn't divide, it multiplied. The day of the hearing, Hannah dressed carefully in a pale blue dress with white buttons. She held Rachel's hand in one and Jason's in the other as they walked into the courthouse. The judge looked at them with a softness in her eyes, perhaps sensing that this wasn't about legal obligation, but about something far more sacred. The guardianship was approved without delay. When they left the courtroom, Hannah didn't cheer or skip. She simply looked up at Jason and asked, "So now it's real?" He smiled. "It was real long before today. But now the world agrees." In celebration, they went to a small diner on the edge of town, not because it was fancy, but because it was the kind of place where people remembered your name and the waitress brought extra whipped cream without asking. They sat in a booth by the window, laughing over milkshakes and fries. Rachel told stories from her childhood. Jason made fun of himself for not knowing how to dance, and Hannah promised she would teach him one day. It wasn't the kind of celebration that came with confetti or speeches. It was the kind that made you feel full without ever being loud. Not long after, Jason launched a community initiative through his company. It wasn't a PR stunt, and it wasn't named after himself. It was called Morning Hands, a program inspired by Hannah, designed to support children and families in crisis. It offered after-school support, emergency housing, job assistance, and mental health resources. He kept his involvement quiet, never once appearing in press photos. But every major decision went through him, and every center that opened had one framed photo near the entrance: a girl in a blue jumpsuit, kneeling beside a bucket, and a man crouched beside her, both of them cleaning the same floor. One afternoon, as autumn began to turn the trees gold, Hannah asked Jason to walk her to school instead of having the driver take her. She liked the way the sidewalks smelled in the morning, and she said his steps made her feel calm. As they walked, she looked up and said, "Do you remember that first day? When I was cleaning and you didn't tell me who you really were?" He nodded. "I remember." "I think I knew," she said. "Not at first. But I felt it. That you weren't really there to clean." Jason smiled gently. "I didn't know why I was there at first either. I just knew I had to stay." They stopped at the school gates, and she hugged him, not the hurried kind of hug that children give when distracted, but a full, grounding hug that stayed for a moment too long. Then she ran through the doors, her ponytail bouncing with every step. Jason stood there for a while, watching, feeling the rare kind of peace that came from a life reshaped not by force, but by grace. Back at home, the gray jumpsuit still hung in his closet, never worn again, but never forgotten. It was no longer just a symbol of where he'd been, it was a reminder of who he became. He kept it there not out of sentimentality, but out of reverence. Because sometimes, the most powerful beginnings come dressed in the simplest cloth. Because sometimes, love doesn't arrive in grand declarations, but in silence, in humility, and in the soft sound of two people cleaning a floor before the sun comes up. And because in the end, it wasn't just the girl he had saved. She had saved him too. To me, the ending of this story is not just satisfying, it's quietly profound. It doesn't rely on a dramatic twist or some grand payoff. Instead, it rewards the reader with something deeper, the truth that real change often begins in the quietest moments, and real love doesn't announce itself, it simply shows up and stays. Jason's transformation isn't just a redemption arc, it's a rediscovery of humanity. He begins the story surrounded by wealth, power, and silence, and ends it surrounded by people, purpose, and warmth. What makes this ending powerful is that nothing is magically fixed. Rachel is still healing, Hannah still carries scars, and Jason still has a lot to learn. But now, they're doing it together. In a world that often praises strength as dominance, this story offers a different kind of strength, showing up when no one asks you to, staying when it's uncomfortable, and giving without needing recognition. The final message is clear: sometimes the most unexpected connections save us, reshape us, and lead us home.